They say money talks, but in Jackson Blackwood's world, silence was the most expensive commodity of all. He was a man who could buy countries, yet on a freezing Tuesday night in Manhattan, his entire empire came crashing down because of a piece of paper the size of a gum wrapper. It wasn't a subpoena. It wasn't a divorce paper. It was a handwritten note, slipped under a medium-rare ribeye steak by a trembling waitress who had nothing left to lose. What she wrote didn't just save his life. It exposed a 20-year-old lie that would shatter New York's elite. What happens when the poorest person in the room holds the darkest secret? You're about to find out. The wind off the Hudson River cut through the streets of Manhattan like a serrated knife. It was November 14th, a Tuesday, the kind of night where the city seemed to huddle in on itself to escape the cold. But inside the Obsidian Room, located on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower, the weather was irrelevant. Here the air smelled of aged mahogany, truffle oil, and old money. Jackson Blackwood sat at table 1, the table permanently reserved for him, though he rarely used it anymore. At 62, Jackson was a titan of industry. His face was a map of hard-won victories, etched with deep lines around a mouth that rarely smiled. He wore a bespoke navy suit, the fabric costing more than most people's cars, and on his wrist sat a Patek Philippe that had stopped ticking 3 years ago, the day his wife, Catherine, died in a plane crash. He never wound it. He liked the reminder that for him, time had officially stopped. Sitting across from him was Carter Hayes. Carter was everything Jackson was not, young, hungry, and polished to a synthetic shine. At 35, Carter was Jackson's protégé, the man slated to take over Blackwood Industries in less than 48 hours. The papers were sitting right there on the table, tucked inside a sleek leather portfolio. "You're quiet tonight, Jackson," Carter said, his voice smooth, like expensive whiskey. He swirled his glass of Pinot Noir, the crimson liquid coating the crystal. "Cold feet, or just savoring the moment?" Jackson stared at the younger man. He felt a heavy exhaustion in his bones. "Just thinking, Carter. It's a lot to hand over. 40 years of my life." "And it's in safe hands," Carter assured him, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You built the foundation. I'm just going to build the skyscraper on top of it. Drink up. We're celebrating." Jackson didn't drink. Not yet. He looked around the restaurant. It was dimly lit, designed for privacy. Shadows clung to the corners. Standing near the kitchen doors, clutching a silver tray against her chest, was Sophie Miller. Sophie was 24, but her eyes held the weariness of someone twice her age. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back tight, but beneath the sleeves, her arms ached from double shifts. She had $6 in her bank account, and rent was due in 3 days. She was invisible here. To men like Carter Hayes, she was part of the furniture, a mechanism that delivered food and removed dirty plates. But Sophie had a superpower. She was invisible, which meant people said things in front of her they would never say in public. "Table 1 needs water," the maitre d', a stern man named Henri, snapped at her, jarring her from her thoughts. "And don't look Mr. Blackwood in the eye. He's in a mood." Sophie nodded, grabbing the crystal pitcher. She moved across the plush carpet, her footsteps silent. As she approached the table, the conversation between the two men didn't stop. They didn't even acknowledge her presence. "The board is ready," Carter was saying, his voice dropping an octave. "Once you sign tonight, the transition begins immediately. No look-backs, Jackson. That was the deal." "I know the deal," Jackson grunted. Sophie poured the water into Jackson's glass. Her hand was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. As she leaned in to fill Carter's glass, her eyes caught something. It was a subtle movement. Carter's hand was resting on the leather portfolio. His cufflink, a distinct, custom gold design shaped like a hawk, glinted in the candlelight. Sophie froze. The water spilled slightly, just a few drops onto the tablecloth. "Watch it!" Carter snapped, recoiling as if she had thrown acid at him. "God, is it that hard to pour water?" I'm so sorry, sir," Sophie stammered, grabbing a cloth. "Leave it," Jackson said, his voice low but commanding. He looked at Sophie for the first time. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a young woman who looked like she had seen a ghost. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and fixed on Carter's wrist. "It's just water, Carter. Calm down." Carter straightened his jacket, annoyed. "Incompetence irritates me, Jackson. You know that. This is a celebration, not a cafeteria." Sophie retreated, her breath catching in her throat. She rushed back to the kitchen, her mind racing. She knew that cufflink. She knew that hawk. And she knew exactly who Carter Hayes really was. But who would believe her? She was a waitress. He was the heir to $1 billion throne. She watched from the service station as Carter pulled a small vial from his pocket while Jackson turned his head to look out the window at the city skyline. It happened in a split second. Carter hovered his hand over Jackson's wine glass. A fine, clear powder drifted down and dissolved instantly. Sophie's blood ran cold. The kitchen was a chaotic symphony of shouting chefs and clattering pans, but inside Sophie's head there was only silence. He's going to kill him. The thought wasn't rational, it was primal. She had seen the powder. But more importantly, she had seen the cufflink. That hawk wasn't just jewelry. It was a crest. The crest of the Waitress Group, a shell company that had evicted her family from their home in Queens 5 years ago. A company that didn't technically exist on paper. If Carter was wearing that, he wasn't just a successor. He was a corporate liquidator. He wasn't there to take over Jackson's company. He was there to strip it for parts and bury the owner. "Sophie, order up, table 1. The chef slammed a plate onto the pass. A 30-day dry-aged ribeye, bone-in, medium rare. The smell of rosemary and seared fat wafted up. Sophie stared at the steak. She had seconds to act. If she walked out there and screamed, "Poison!" Carter would deny it. He would claim it was sweetener or medication. She would be fired, arrested for slander, and Jackson would drink the wine anyway just to prove a point. She needed to speak to Jackson without speaking. Her hands were shaking as she reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out her order pad and a cheap ballpoint pen. She tore off a small strip of paper. She wrote 6 words. She folded the paper until it was no bigger than a stamp. "Sophie, go!" Henri barked. She picked up the heavy ceramic plate. Her heart felt like a bird trapped in a cage. She walked out of the kitchen, the noise fading into the hushed atmosphere of the dining room. The walk to table 1 felt like walking to the gallows. Jackson was still looking out the window, looking old and sad. Carter was smiling, tapping his fingers on the stem of the poisoned wine glass. "Here we are," Carter said, looking at the steak. "Finally. I was about to starve." Sophie placed Carter's meal down first, a lobster risotto. Then she moved to Jackson. "Your steak, sir," she whispered. As she lowered the plate, she did something strictly forbidden. She didn't just set it down. She tilted the plate slightly, sliding the folded piece of paper directly under the rim of the plate, right where Jackson's left hand was resting on the tablecloth. She pressed her finger briefly against Jackson's hand. A microsecond of contact. Jackson flinched. He looked up, startled. Sophie's eyes locked with his. They were intense, pleading, terrified. She gave a microscopic shake of her head, her eyes darting to the wine glass, then back to him. "Enjoy," she choked out. She turned and walked away, her legs feeling like jelly. Jackson frowned. He felt the coarse texture of paper under his pinky finger. He didn't move his hand immediately. He was a man of instinct. He had survived hostile takeovers and boardroom coups by reading people. The terror in that girl's eyes was real. "Something wrong with the steak?" Carter asked, slicing into his lobster. "You haven't touched it." "Just admiring the presentation," Jackson said. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. Slowly, casually, Jackson slid his hand back, palming the small scrap of paper. He brought his napkin up to his mouth, pretending to wipe his lips, and unfolded the note inside the linen. He glanced down. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. "Don't drink. He put powder in it. Ask him about Veritas." Jackson froze. The world seemed to stop. Veritas. He hadn't heard that name in 20 years. It was the name of a project he had shut down, a project that was supposed to be unethical, dangerous, a project he thought he had buried along with his darker past. Jackson lowered the napkin. He looked at the wine glass, a rich, dark vintage. It looked innocent. Then he looked at Carter. The young man was eating with gusto, but his eyes kept flicking to Jackson's glass, waiting. "You're not drinking, Jackson," Carter said, a hint of impatience in his tone. "We need to toast to the future." Jackson picked up the glass. He saw Carter's shoulders relax, a subtle exhale. Jackson swirled the wine. He brought it to his lips. He could smell the oak, the berries, and something else. A faint, bitter almond scent that shouldn't be there. He paused, the rim of the glass hovering an inch from his mouth. "You know, Carter," Jackson said softly, "I was just thinking about the past, about how I started. Ancient history, Jackson. Drink." "I was thinking about a specific project," Jackson continued, his eyes hardening into steel. "Project Veritas." The color drained from Carter's face so fast it looked like a vacuum had sucked the life out of him. His fork clattered against the plate. I don't know what you're talking about," Carter stammered. "Don't you?" Jackson set the glass down. He didn't drink. "Then why is your heart rate visible through your necktie?" Jackson picked up the steak knife. He wasn't going to eat. "Waitress!" Jackson bellowed. The entire restaurant went silent. Henri, the maître d', looked horrified. Sophie stopped in her tracks near the kitchen door. "Yes, sir?" Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Come here," Jackson commanded. Sophie walked back to the table. She looked at Carter, who was now glaring at her with a mix of confusion and murderous rage. "Did you drop this?" Jackson held up the note. Sophie's breath hitched. If she admitted it, she could be fired. If she denied it, Jackson might die. "Yes," Sophie said, her voice clear. "I did." "You're fired," Carter shouted, standing up. "Get out of here. She's disturbing our meal, Jackson. She's crazy." "Sit down, Carter," Jackson said. It wasn't a request. It was an order delivered with the weight of a sledgehammer. Jackson looked at Sophie. "You mentioned Veritas. How does a waitress at a steakhouse know the name of a classified Black Ops shell company dissolved in 2004? Sophie looked at the billionaire. "Because, Mr. Blackwood, Veritas didn't just disappear. It went bankrupt. And when it did, my father took the fall for the embezzlement you didn't know about. My name isn't Sophie Miller. It's Sophie Vance. And that man," she pointed a shaking finger at Carter, "that man is wearing my father's watch." The silence in the obsidian room was heavy, suffocating. The other diners had stopped eating. The clinking of silverware had ceased. Everyone was watching table 1. Carter Hayes looked down at his wrist. He instinctively covered the watch with his other hand, a gesture of guilt so obvious it was almost comical. "She's lying," Carter hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. "She's a grifter, Jackson, looking for a payout. Look at her shoes. Look at her hands. She's nobody." Jackson didn't look at Sophie's shoes. He looked at her eyes. They were the same shade of grey as his late wife's. "Vance," Jackson repeated the name. "Arthur Vance?" "He was your accountant," Sophie said, tears welling up but refusing to fall. "The one who supposedly stole $3 million and vanished? He didn't steal it, Mr. Blackwood. He found out who did. He found the paper trail leading to a shell account in the Caymans. And when he tried to bring it to you, he was threatened. They told him if he spoke to you, they'd kill me and my mother." Sophie took a step closer, ignoring Henri, who was frantically signaling for security. "He gave up everything to protect us. He went to prison. He died there 2 years ago." Sophie's voice broke. The only thing he had left was that watch, a vintage Rolex with an inscription on the back, "Truth above all." When he died in custody, his personal effects were missing. The warden said they were lost. She stared at Carter. "Take it off." Carter laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "This is insane. I bought this at an auction in Geneva." "Take it off," Jackson said. His voice was quiet, terrifyingly calm. He picked up the wine glass, the poisoned one, and held it up to the light. "Or I hand this glass to the police lab, Carter, and we see what's in it. Cyanide, arsenic, or something newer?" Carter's arrogance crumbled. The confident executive vanished, replaced by a cornered rat. He looked at the door. 2 large security guards were blocking the exit, sensing the tension. "Jackson, listen to me," Carter pleaded, his hands shaking. "The merger, the investors, they needed assurances. You were taking too long. You were getting sentimental. The company needs fresh blood." "So you decided to spill mine?" Jackson asked. "I didn't have a choice," Carter snapped. The board didn't send you here with poison," Jackson interrupted. "That's personal. That's sloppy." Jackson stood up. He was tall, imposing, a lion rousing from a nap. He walked around the table to Carter. "Give me the watch." Carter hesitated, then slowly unclasped the gold band. He dropped it into Jackson's hand. Jackson turned it over. The metal was cool against his skin. He squinted at the inscription on the back. "Truth above all." Jackson closed his eyes. Memories flooded back. Arthur Vance, a good man, a quiet man. Jackson had believed the reports. He had believed Arthur stole the money. He had let an innocent man rot in a cell while he groomed the man who framed him. Jackson opened his eyes and looked at Sophie. "I owe you a debt I cannot pay, Miss Vance." "I don't want your money," Sophie said, wiping her face. "I want justice." "You'll have it," Jackson promised. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He dialed a number that hadn't been used in years. "Bring the car around," Jackson said into the phone, "and call the legal team. All of them. We're going to war." He looked at Carter. "Don't leave town, Carter, though I doubt you'll make it to the airport before my security team freezes your assets." Jackson turned to Sophie. "Get your coat. You're done waitressing." "Where are we going?" Sophie asked, confused. "To my office," Jackson said, placing the watch in his pocket. "We have to find the rest of the rats in my company, and you, my dear, are the only one who knows where the nest is." But as they walked toward the exit, leaving a stunned Carter Hayes at the table with a poisoned glass of wine and a cold steak, the kitchen doors burst open. 3 men in dark, heavy coats marched in. They weren't customers. They weren't police. They moved with military precision. Carter saw them and smiled. A sick, twisted smile. "You really think it was just me, Jackson?" Carter yelled across the room. "You think I acted alone? You're not leaving this building." The lead intruder reached inside his coat. Sophie screamed, "Get down!" She tackled Jackson just as the first shot shattered the magnum of champagne on the serving station. Glass exploded everywhere. The restaurant erupted into chaos. The first bullet didn't hit a person. It hit the intricate chandelier above the center of the room, raining jagged crystals down like diamond hail. Screams erupted. The elite patrons of the Obsidian Room, people who controlled hedge funds and media empires, scrambled under tables like frightened children. Sophie didn't scramble. She rolled. She shoved Jackson Blackwood, a man worth $60 billion, behind the heavy oak bar. Bottles of vodka and gin exploded above their heads as the gunman sprayed the room with suppressive fire. "We need to move!" Sophie yelled over the noise of shattering glass. Jackson was clutching his shoulder. He wasn't shot, but he had landed hard. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert. The shock of the betrayal had worn off, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. "My security detail," Jackson rasped. They were outside. "They're gone," Sophie said grimly, peeking over the mahogany counter. "Those men at the door didn't walk past them. They walked over them. We can't go out the front." "The elevator?" "Death trap. They'll cut the cables or wait for the doors to open." Sophie grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "The kitchen. Now." They stayed low, crawling through the debris of the high society dinner. Spilled caviar, broken china, and lost shoes. Carter Hayes was standing near the entrance, safe behind the wall of muscle he had hired. He wasn't shooting. He was watching, a cruel smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his cuffs. "Find them," Carter ordered, "and bring me the girl, alive. She has information I need." Sophie kicked open the swinging doors to the kitchen. The staff had vanished. Chefs, sous chefs, and dishwashers had fled through the back fire exit the moment the first shot rang out. The kitchen was eerily silent, save for the hiss of steam from a pot of unattended lobster bisque boiling over on the stove. "The fire exit," Jackson pointed to the red sign at the back. "No," Sophie stopped him. "Too obvious. That leads to the alley. They'll have a sniper on the roof watching the door. It's a kill zone." "Then where?" Jackson demanded. "We're trapped, Miss Vance." Sophie looked around the stainless steel labyrinth she had worked in for 3 years. She knew every inch of this place. She knew which floor tiles were loose, which freezer door stuck, and more importantly, she knew where the unofficial breaks happened. "The dumbwaiter," she said. Jackson looked at the small metal hatch in the wall, used for sending dirty linens down to the laundry on the 30th floor. "You cannot be serious. I am 6'2", and you're about to be 6 foot under if you argue with me," Sophie snapped. She ran to the hatch and yanked it open. "It's an industrial lift. It holds 300 pounds. It goes down to the laundry sorting room. From there, we can access the service tunnels." Jackson hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instinct. Suddenly, the kitchen doors swung open. 2 gunmen entered, their tactical boots crunching on the tile. They moved tactically, checking corners. Sophie put a finger to her lips. She pointed to the walk-in freezer. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the hanging rack. As the first gunman rounded the corner, passing the prep station, Sophie didn't attack him directly. She threw a metal mixing bowl across the room. It clattered loudly against the dish pit. The gunman whipped around, raising his weapon toward the noise. "Clear," he whispered into his comms. As he turned back, Jackson Blackwood stepped out from behind the rack. He held a canister of industrial-grade pepper spray, standard issue for kitchen security. He unleashed a stream directly into the man's face. The gunman howled, blindingly firing a shot into the ceiling. Before the second gunman could react, Sophie swung the cast-iron skillet with all the leverage of her double shifts. The heavy iron connected with the back of his knee. He buckled. As he fell, she swung again, this time connecting with his helmet. He went limp. "Not bad," Jackson said, breathing hard, tossing the empty spray can aside. "I played softball in Queens," Sophie said, her hands shaking as the adrenaline dumped into her system. "Now get in the lift." They scrambled toward the dumbwaiter. Jackson climbed in awkwardly, folding his long legs. It was a tight squeeze. "What about you?" Jackson asked, panic flaring in his eyes. "There's no room." "I'll take the grease chute," Sophie lied. She pressed the button. "I'll meet you at the bottom. Laundry room. Don't move until I get there." "Sophie." The door slid shut, cutting him off. The motor hummed, and Jackson Blackwood began his descent into the bowels of the building. Sophie stood alone in the kitchen. She looked at the grease chute. It was welded shut. She had lied because the lift could only take one, and Jackson was the target. She heard voices approaching. Carter's voice. "Check the freezer," he was saying. Sophie looked around. Her eyes landed on the ventilation grate above the stove. It was narrow, greasy, and hot. She grabbed a crate, climbed up, and unscrewed the grate with a butter knife she pulled from her apron. She shimmied inside the ductwork just as Carter Hayes walked into the kitchen, stepping over the unconscious gunman. "They're gone," the mercenary leader growled. Carter looked at the dumbwaiter. The light showed it was in use, descending. "Cut the power," Carter said calmly. "Stop the lift between floors. Let the old man suffocate for a while. I want to find the girl." From the vent above, Sophie held her breath. A drop of sweat rolled down her nose and landed on Carter's shoulder. He froze. He slowly looked up. Sophie scrambled backward into the darkness of the duct, just as bullets tore through the metal grate where her head had been a second ago. The noise was deafening in the confined space. The metal vibrated against her ribs. She crawled on her elbows and knees, the smell of old grease and dust choking her. She knew this ventilation system. It connected the restaurant to the HVAC unit on the unfinished 41st floor. Below her, she heard Carter screaming, "Get a ladder! Get into the vents!" Sophie moved faster. Her knees were scraped raw, her uniform torn. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a soldier. She was a waitress who liked reading mystery novels and had a father who taught her to never trust a man in a three-piece suit. She reached a junction in the vent and kicked the grate out. It clattered onto the concrete floor below. She dropped down, landing in a cloud of drywall dust. She was on the 41st floor. It was a construction zone, exposed wires, metal studs, bags of cement. The windows were taped over, casting the massive floor in eerie shadows. She needed to help Jackson. Carter had ordered the power cut. That meant the dumbwaiter was stuck somewhere in the shaft between the 42nd and 30th floors. Sophie ran to the service elevator bank. The panel was dark, dead. "Think, Sophie, think," she whispered to herself. She spotted a contractor's heavy-duty tool chest left open near a pile of lumber. She rummaged through it. A hammer, a crowbar, a high-beam flashlight, and a walkie-talkie. She grabbed the walkie-talkie. It was set to the construction crew's channel. But maybe... She turned the dial. Static. Static. Then... "Floor 30 is clear. Team B, moving to 41. They were coming. Sophie looked at the elevator doors. She jammed the crowbar into the seam of the center service shaft. With a grunt of exertion, she leveraged her weight. The doors groaned and popped open. She looked down the dark shaft. The cables disappeared into the abyss. About 20 feet down, she saw the top of the metal box. The dumbwaiter. "Mr. Blackwood!" she hissed, her voice echoing in the shaft. "I'm here!" Jackson's voice came back, muffled and angry. "I'm stuck. The air is getting thin." "I'm going to get you out," Sophie called down. "But you have to open the top hatch. It's latched from the outside." Sophie looked around. She needed a rope. There was none. But there was a heavy yellow extension cord powering the saw bench. She grabbed it, tying one end around a concrete pillar and the other around her waist. "I'm coming down," she whispered. She rappelled into the elevator shaft. It was terrifying. The darkness below seemed infinite. If the cord snapped, she would fall 40 stories. She landed with a thud on top of the dumbwaiter car. She unlatched the hatch and pulled it open. Jackson's face appeared, illuminated by her flashlight. He looked disheveled, covered in sweat, his tie undone. "You are a remarkably resourceful young woman," he said, taking her hand as she pulled him up through the hatch to sit on top of the car. "Save the performance review for later," Sophie said. "We need to climb up to 41. The mercenaries are sweeping the building." They climbed the extension cord, Jackson groaning with effort. He wasn't young, but he was tough. When they tumbled back onto the concrete floor of the 41st level, they collapsed for a moment. "Why?" Jackson asked, staring at the ceiling. "Why help me? You know what my company did to your father. You should have let me drink the poison." Sophie sat up, dusting off her apron. "My father didn't hate you, Mr. Blackwood. He pitied you. He used to say, 'Jackson is a genius, but he's blind. He surrounds himself with sharks and thinks they're dolphins. If I let you die, Carter wins. And if Carter wins, the truth about my dad stays buried forever. I'm not saving you for you. I'm saving you for him." Jackson looked at her, stunned. For the first time in 20 years, he felt a pang of genuine shame. "I will make it right," Jackson said quietly. "If we survive this." "Target located," a voice shouted from the far end of the floor. Beams of tactical light cut through the darkness. 3 men were advancing behind plastic sheeting. "Go!" Sophie yelled. They ran through the maze of metal studs. Bullets punched through the drywall, puffs of white dust exploding around them. "We can't outrun them," Jackson yelled. "We don't have to," Sophie said. She pointed to a pallet of concrete bags, suspended by a chain from a ceiling hoist. It was positioned directly over the main walkway the mercenaries were using. Sophie grabbed the release lever on the wall. "Wait for it," she whispered. The footsteps got closer. Shadows danced on the plastic sheets. "Now!" She yanked the lever. The chain unspooled with a screech. The pallet, weighing a ton, crashed down. There was a sickening crunch and screams of surprise. The floor shook. The impact created a massive cloud of dust that blinded the attackers. "Move while they're blind!" Sophie grabbed Jackson's arm. They sprinted toward the unfinished executive suite on the north side. "Where are we going?" Jackson coughed. "My secret spot," Sophie said. "When I wanted to cry during my break, I came here. It has the only thing on this floor that works." They burst into a room that was just concrete walls and a large glass window overlooking the city. In the corner, connected to a temporary power supply, was a biometric security terminal. "This is the hard line for the future security system," Sophie explained. "The contractors were testing it yesterday. It's live." Jackson rushed to the panel. He placed his hand on the scanner. "Access denied." "Damn it!" Jackson hit the wall. "It's not coded to me yet. It's a closed loop." "It's not coded to you," Sophie said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out the Rolex she had taken from Carter, her father's watch. "Sophie, that's a watch, not a keycard," Jackson said, watching the door, expecting gunmen to burst in any second. "My father was the head accountant," Sophie said, her fingers working quickly to pop the back case of the watch open with the edge of the crowbar. "He didn't just hide evidence in paper. He was a tech hobbyist." She pulled a tiny, flat microchip from inside the mechanism of the watch. He told me once, "If you ever need to open the doors of the kingdom, look at the time." Sophie jammed the chip into the maintenance port of the terminal. The screen flickered. Code scrolled rapidly. "System override. Welcome, Administrator Vance." The entire building's schematic appeared on the screen. "My God," Jackson whispered. Arthur built a back door into the entire mainframe. "He wanted to make sure the truth could get out," Sophie said. Jackson tapped the screen furiously. "I can lock down the elevators. I can cut the lights. I can activate the fire suppression system." "Do it," Sophie said. Jackson hit execute. Instantly, the emergency alarms blared. Steel shutters slammed down over the windows and doors on every floor. The sprinkler system erupted, drenching the building. On the screen, they watched the camera feeds. The mercenaries on the 41st floor were slipping, confused, trapped between the security gates. "We bought some time," Jackson said, "but not much. Carter has the master codes. He can override this in 10 minutes. "Then we have 10 minutes to get out," Sophie said. "No," Jackson said, his face hardening. "I'm done running. Look at the feed for the penthouse." Sophie looked at the screen. Carter Hayes was in Jackson's office on the 50th floor. He wasn't alone. He was on a video conference call. Jackson zoomed in. The faces on the screen were the board of directors. "They aren't confused," Jackson said coldly. "They're celebrating. They think I'm dead." Jackson turned to Sophie. "We aren't leaving the building, Sophie. We're going upstairs. I'm going to crash that meeting." Going up was suicide, but Jackson Blackwood was a man who had built an empire on impossible odds. "The construction elevator on the exterior," Jackson said, pointing to the window. "It goes to the roof. From there, we can drop down into the penthouse balcony." They moved to the window. The wind was howling outside. The external hoist, a metal cage clinging to the side of the skyscraper, swayed violently in the gale. "I hate heights," Sophie muttered. "I'll hold your hand," Jackson said. And he meant it. They climbed out onto the scaffolding. The wind whipped Sophie's hair across her face. Below them, the lights of Manhattan looked like a distant galaxy. One slip, and they were gone. They climbed into the rattling cage. Jackson hit the manual override. The hoist jerked upward, clanking against the rails. As they rose past the 45th, 46th, 47th floors, Jackson spoke. "When I founded Blackwood Industries, I wanted to change the world. Clean energy, medicine. Somewhere along the way, I got addicted to the stock price instead of the mission. I let men like Carter into the fold because they promised growth. I ignored Arthur because he promised caution." He looked at Sophie. "Your father was the only honest man I knew. And I killed him by looking the other way." "He forgave you," Sophie said softly, the wind tearing the words from her mouth. "He wrote it in his letters. He said, 'Jackson isn't evil. He's just asleep. One day, he'll wake up.'" The cage jolted to a halt at the roof level. They scrambled onto the helipad. It was raining hard now. The penthouse was directly below. A glass skylight looked down into the main office. They could see Carter Hayes pacing below, holding a glass of champagne. The large monitor on the wall showed 6 board members. "To the transition," Carter was saying, raising his glass, "and to the unfortunate accident that claimed our beloved founder." Jackson looked around the roof. He saw a ventilation fan housing. "Sophie," Jackson said, "I need you to stay here. If this goes wrong, hide until the police come." "No," Sophie said. She picked up a heavy metal pipe lying near the AC unit. "We started this dinner together. We're finishing it." Jackson smiled, a genuine smile. "Very well. On 3. Jackson and Sophie grabbed a heavy concrete planter used for rooftop landscaping. They dragged it to the edge of the skylight. 1, 2, 3. They heaved the stone planter onto the tempered glass. Crash. The sound was like a bomb going off. The planter smashed through the skylight, raining shards of glass and concrete down into the center of the penthouse office. Carter screamed and dove for cover. Jackson didn't wait. He jumped through the hole, landing on the plush carpet, rolling to absorb the impact. Sophie followed, landing more gracefully thanks to her younger knees. Carter scrambled up, pulling a handgun from his jacket. "You!" Carter shrieked, his eyes bulging. "You're supposed to be dead." "I'm hard to digest," Jackson growled. Carter raised the gun. "It doesn't matter. I'll finish it myself." "Mr. Hayes!" A voice boomed from the wall. Carter froze. On the giant screen, the board of directors was watching. They looked horrified. "What is the meaning of this?" the chairman asked. "Jackson? You're alive?" "Alive and present," Jackson said, straightening his suit, brushing glass from his shoulder. He stood in front of the camera, and witnessing an attempted murder. "He's lying!" Carter yelled, the gun shaking in his hand. "He's gone senile. He attacked me." "Did I?" Jackson pointed to the screen. "And the mercenaries downstairs, the poison in my wine, and this." Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out the vial of clear powder Carter had used earlier. He had swiped it from the table during the chaos of the initial shooting. "I believe the police will find your fingerprints all over this, Carter." Carter looked at the camera. The board members were cutting their feeds one by one. They were distancing themselves. He was alone. Carter's face twisted into a mask of pure hate. He turned the gun back to Jackson. "If I go down, you're coming with me." He pulled the trigger. Click. Carter blinked. He pulled it again. Click. Sophie stepped forward, holding a small metal spring in her hand. "Looking for this?" she asked. Carter looked at his gun. The slide assembly pin was missing. "When you fell in the kitchen," Sophie said coolly, "I didn't just hit you with a skillet. I bumped into you. My dad taught me how to field strip a Glock in 3 seconds. You really should pay more attention to the help." Carter screamed in frustration and lunged at Sophie with his bare hands. Jackson stepped in. He didn't use a weapon. He used a right hook that had 40 years of repressed anger behind it. His fist connected with Carter's jaw. There was a sickening crack. Carter Hayes spun around and collapsed, unconscious before he hit the floor. Jackson stood over him, panting. He adjusted his tie. "Table 1 is closed," Jackson muttered. Sirens wailed in the distance. Real sirens this time. Blue and red lights washed over the shattered penthouse. Sophie slumped against the desk, sliding down to the floor. She was exhausted, bleeding, and covered in dust. Jackson walked over and sat down beside her on the floor. The billionaire and the waitress, sitting in the wreckage of an empire. "You're fired," Jackson said. Sophie looked at him, eyes wide. "What?" "You're fired as a waitress," Jackson clarified. "I need a new chief of operations, someone who notices the details, someone who isn't afraid to break a skylight." Sophie laughed, a tired, hysterical sound. "I don't have a degree." "You have a watch," Jackson said, pointing to the Rolex in her hand. "And tonight, that's worth more than any diploma." The elevator doors pinged open. A SWAT team swarmed into the room. "Hands in the air!" they screamed. Jackson slowly raised his hands. He looked at Sophie and winked. "Just wait until they see the bill for the damages." The trial of Carter Hayes didn't just make the evening news, it became the news. For 3 months, the Southern District of New York became a theater of corporate warfare. The evidence pulled from Arthur Vance's Rolex was undeniable. It wasn't just a ledger of financial crimes, it was a roadmap of corruption that implicated 3 senators, a foreign diplomat, and half the board of directors of Blackwood Industries. On the final day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Jackson Blackwood sat in the front row, looking sharper than he had in decades. Beside him sat Sophie Vance. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her hair styled professionally, a heavy gold pin on her lapel in the shape of a hawk, reclaimed and rebranded. When the judge read the verdict, consecutive life sentences for conspiracy to commit murder and grand larceny, Carter Hayes didn't scream or fight. He simply slumped in his chair, a broken man who realized too late that he had bet against the wrong people. But the real story wasn't the man going to prison. It was the man who had died there. 2 weeks after the verdict, Jackson summoned Sophie to his private office. It was a Saturday. The building was empty, quiet, and peaceful. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Sophie asked, stepping in. "I told you, Sophie, call me Jackson. Sir is for people who don't save my life," Jackson said, standing by the panoramic window. "And I have something to show you." He gestured to the large screen on the wall. "We finished decrypting the final partition of the data on your father's watch," Jackson said softly. It wasn't just numbers. There was a video file, dated 3 days before his arrest. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "A video? He wanted you to see this. And he wanted me to see it too." Jackson pressed a button on his desk. The screen flickered to life. The image was grainy, recorded on an old webcam. Arthur Vance appeared. He looked tired, younger than Sophie remembered, but his eyes were kind. He was sitting in his cramped office, the same Rolex prominent on his wrist. "If you're watching this," Arthur's voice filled the room, crackling slightly. "Then the worst has happened. I've been caught. Sophie, my sweet girl, I need you to know that I didn't steal that money for myself." Sophie walked closer to the screen, tears streaming down her face. She reached out, as if to touch him. On screen, Arthur leaned in. "Jackson, I know you'll see this eventually. You're probably angry. You probably think I betrayed you. But you were blind, old friend. The board was funneling money into Project Veritas to destabilize a region in the Cobalt Belt. They were going to start a war for profit, using your company's name. I couldn't stop them legally. They own the judges. So I moved the capital." Arthur held up a piece of paper in the video. "I didn't embezzle it. I hid it. $300 million. It's in a trust, locked by a biometrics key that only responds to 2 people. Me and Sophie." Arthur smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I'm going to prison to protect you, Jackson. If I told you the truth now, you'd fight them, and they would kill you. You're not ready. You need to sleep a little longer until the sharks eat themselves. Sophie, use the money to fix the world. And Jackson, forgive yourself. You were always the dreamer. I was just the bookkeeper." The screen went black. The silence in the office was absolute. Jackson Blackwood, the iron-willed titan of industry, sat down heavily in his chair and wept. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. For 20 years he had believed his best friend was a thief. In reality, his best friend had been his guardian angel, walking into a cage so Jackson could live. Sophie walked over to him. She didn't say a word. She just placed a hand on his shoulder. "He never hated you," Sophie whispered. "He saved you." Jackson looked up, wiping his eyes. He looked at Sophie, and for the first time, he didn't just see Arthur's daughter. He saw the future. "The money," Jackson said, his voice raspy. "The 300 million. It's yours." "No," Sophie said firmly. "It's ours." That was his wish, to fix what Veritas broke. 6 months later. The wind was cold off the Hudson, just like that night at the steakhouse. But inside the newly renovated Vance Community Center in Queens, it was warm and bright. The press was there, cameras flashing. Jackson Blackwood stood at the podium, cutting the red ribbon. "This facility," Jackson announced to the crowd, "is just the beginning. The Arthur Vance Foundation is dedicated to providing legal defense for the wrongly accused and housing for the displaced. And leading this initiative is our new CEO." Jackson stepped aside. Sophie took the podium. She looked out at the crowd. In the back, she saw her old manager, Henri, from the steakhouse. He gave her a small, respectful nod. "My father believed that the truth is the only currency that matters," Sophie said, her voice strong and clear. "He used to tell me that you can tell a lot about a person by how they treat the person pouring their water. We are going to build a world where everyone gets a seat at the table." After the ceremony, Jackson and Sophie escaped the crowd. They walked down the street to a small, unassuming diner, the kind of place where the menu is laminated and the coffee is served in thick ceramic mugs. They sat in a booth. A young waitress, looking exhausted and stressed, hurried over with a pot of coffee. She had a stain on her apron and looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Sorry I'm late," the waitress said nervously. "It's my first week." "Take your time," Jackson said with a smile. "We're in no rush." The waitress poured the coffee. As she turned to leave, Sophie spoke up. "Excuse me?" The waitress turned back, bracing for a complaint. "Yes, Mom?" Sophie pulled out a pen and wrote something on a napkin. She folded it and slid it across the table, along with $100 bill. "Keep the change," Sophie said. "And read the note." The waitress looked confused. She picked up the napkin as she walked back to the counter. She unfolded it. Written in neat cursive were 5 words. "Hang in there. It gets better." Below it was a phone number and a name. Sophie Vance, CEO, the Vance Foundation. Jackson watched the waitress read it. He saw her eyes go wide, then look back at their booth with a mixture of shock and hope. "You're enjoying this too much," Jackson chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "Just paying it forward," Sophie smiled, tapping the face of her father's Rolex on her wrist. "Just paying it forward." They clinked their cheap coffee mugs together. The Billionaire and the Waitress. They had started with a poisoned glass of wine and ended with a cup of diner coffee, and for the first time in both of their lives, it tasted like freedom. And that is the story of how a single note changed the course of history for Jackson Blackwood and Sophie Vance. It's a powerful reminder that integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching, and sometimes when everyone is watching. Sophie's father, Arthur, made the ultimate sacrifice for loyalty, proving that true wealth isn't what you have in the bank, but who you have in your corner. I want to ask you a question. If you found a note under your plate today that told you your life was in danger, who is the one person you would trust to help you? Tag them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and redemption, please destroy that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. We have an even crazier story coming up next week about a homeless man who won the lottery and bought the bank that foreclosed on his house. You do not want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, always read the fine print and never underestimate the waitress.